there's a lot of challenges that Obama had when he was running for president. Was America ready for a black president? It clearly was. And just want to ask you, what about America being ready for its first Asian American president? Have you thought about that?
I've been campaigning in Iowa and Ohio and New Hampshire, and I have to say that my race has not been a huge pressing issue for many of the voters there. Like, they're more focused on what I can do, what my vision is for the country, and what my vision would do for them and their families. I mean, they're most concerned about their own well-being and their families and their communities. So I don't think that my race is an issue to the voters in the places that I've been, at least campaigning.
You propose that every police officer is equipped with a body camera. There are a lot of departments that have body cameras, but they don't release the footage.
Yeah, it's a problem.
So are you going to get around that? Because you're for funding the cameras, the departments often refuse to release the footage. So how do you get around it?
Yeah, so what you have to do is you have to set up like a legal predisposition where when you show up at like the hearing of the tribunal and then you ask, hey, where's the footage? And then they're like, hey, we don't have it, I don't use it. Then that ends up starting to count as like a negative factor against the officer, where it's like, wait, if you don't have the footage, then we're actually going to start like questioning more closely like your version of events. Because right now the absence of footage is sort of a default. If you make it so that the footage is the default, and then the absence of footage means that maybe something shady went on, then you can start trying to ratchet up the incentive so that people have to not just have the cameras on, but then use the footage to figure out what happened after the fact.
What's the punishment when police officers don't comply?
This is one of the trickiest things, is that police have a hard time policing themselves. It's like, and that's not unique to that particular group of people. I mean, like it's true of a lot of groups.
Yeah, but most groups don't have guns.
Yes. So the question is, how do you actually have some sort of enforcement mechanism that's independent of the existing police department, particularly when you're trying to figure out what happened after the fact? And that's something that I am very, very open to empowering some sort of independent body in the Department of Justice or elsewhere to sort of assist with trying to figure out what happened. And then if you don't have footage, then they'll be like, look, if you don't have footage, then unfortunately we're going to starting to see that as very, very negative. But the first step is making sure that everyone can have the footage. And then the second step is saying, okay, look, if you don't have the footage, then something that's not kosher might have gone down here.
There are many people who feel that policing as we know it is unsustainable and that it needs to be abolished and replaced with a different type of enforcement. What is your response to that?
Well, I think that's insightful in the sense that community-based policing would be much, much more effective in many, many situations, and trying to demilitarize police departments. It's like a lot of these police departments have essentially military hardware. And then so if you have military hardware and you don't really know the people you're policing, then you wind up with this very, very naturally mistrustful dynamic.
Would you cut off any type of program federally that would give police officers military equipment?
Yes, I would. I do not think that police departments need military equipment in 98% of situations, and that if they do need it, then there are other units that can assist with that. I mean, that's why these other units exist.
What makes you different from Bernie Sanders? Because both y'all talk about giving everybody free stuff.
Well, I'm aligned with many of Bernie's goals and values. Like, I think my approaches are sometimes a little bit different, and I would argue a bit more modern. The main thing I distinguish myself in terms of the freedom dividend is I just want to give everyone straight cash of $1,000 a month. Like, that's the most impactful thing we can do. And then, like, a lot of Bernie's things try and get to the same place, but like do it through various institutions, like free public college and like this and that. And I'm like, no, straight cash. Like, money is the most effective way we can help people improve the situations for their families, their communities, and themselves.
Have you experienced racism in your life?
I was the lone skinny Asian kid in an all-white neighborhood, so I experienced a lot of that sort of like juvenile, taunting. I was called, like gook and chink and things like that all the time as a kid. I understand what it's like to be in that situation. I would not pretend to understand what it's like to grow up African American. because they're very different sorts of experiences. But I know what it's like to have had my set of experiences, and I understand that when someone meets me, the first thing they register is that I'm Asian or Asian American, and then some things go through their heads, and I understand like what that process is. One of the things I think is going wrong in this country is that we've sort of oversimplified racism into particular things. Like, to me, a lot of racism has to be about some kind of power dynamic. It's like, if you see me and acknowledge my race, like in your head, like, of course you do. That's like just human nature. Like, that's not racism. Racism is when somehow there's some kind of like negative impact on my life because there's a power dynamic that I'm on the other end of. And so, we have to try and address this institutional or systemic racism where we can find it, while also like looking at each other and saying like, hey, the fact that you notice, that I'm like of a certain background, I mean, that's not a problem.
You tweeted back in June 2018 about the deaths of whites outnumbering births, and that sparked a backlash from people who thinks that falls into the narrative of white genocide in America. Just wanted to ask you how you respond to that criticism.
I mean, I was literally just retweeting a New York Times article that had a stat that said, hey, like more whites are dying in various counties than are being born. And then I looked at that, and a lot of it's because of opiate deaths. And so I just retweeted that, like, because, to me, that's a really compelling picture. It's that if you have communities that are dying of drugs, I mean, and it's not, frankly, communities that like people had previously associated with that sort of phenomenon. But I care about it's like I mean, you probably see if you went back to my Twitter, I've like tweeted about a lot of different things.
Yeah, but I think the critique is that it plays into this notion of the white person is dying in America, and people of color are kind of coming in and taking over. That's the sentiment, even though that retweet may not have come across that way.
No, and I appreciate that, and thank you for providing the context. So, here are just the straight facts. Americans are dying younger because of suicides and drug overdoses, regardless of their racial background. Like, our overall life expectancy has declined for the last 3 years, which is almost unheard of in a developed country. That's just gruesome and horrific for all of us, of any background. You look around and be like, wait a minute, we're supposed to be the richest, most advanced country in the world, and we're dying of drugs and suicides at epic levels to the point where it's actually bringing our life expectancy down. And so I completely disagree with the narrative you just described, which is like that somehow like other people are like taking over. What I'm saying is like there's just like a society-wide disintegration that's happening to us all. And we need to start looking at it and being like, is it normal for developed countries' life expectancy to go down 3 years in a row? No, it is not.
So what type of plan would you have specifically for Flint, Michigan as president?
At this point, it's like a national tragedy / embarrassment that the people in Flint still have unsafe drinking water. And the problem is that the United States of America has gotten really bad at building and rebuilding, where what's happened is you have this very old set of pipes that have then contaminated the drinking water for this population, and all of these families and children are suffering as a result. The problem is that those resources would theoretically come from the state of Michigan, and Michigan does not have the resources to say, like, look, we need to just redo this. Like what they did is they tried to save a few bucks here and there, and then it ended up, and then they tried to sort of hand wave away the fact that this contamination was happening. So I will vow as president, we're going to make the drinking water in Flint crystal safe as can be, and whatever that takes. And if that takes federal money going in and just tearing out all of those pipes and rebuilding them from ground zero, then that's what we're going to do. And if the state of Michigan doesn't have the will to do that, then we'll do it as the federal government.
Do you feel that as president that there should be a federal inquiry into what happened?
Yes. And the thing is, like, Flint is a national symbol, but there are other Flints. Flint is not an isolated case in the sense that there are other decaying water systems that are now funneling contaminated water to children in other communities. And this is, in many ways, an emblem of what's going wrong in our country, is that these systems were built decades ago, sometimes in cases where they didn't even know like that some of this stuff existed. And then we've let it decay over decades because we've just gotten terrible at actually building or rebuilding anything in this country. Our infrastructure is falling apart. And then, of course, it's poor communities that get ignored politically that end up bearing the brunt of it.
How much of that criminality in it and how much of the lack of political will is fueled by racism?
A significant amount of it, because right now in this society, money talks. Where if there was like some like rich white suburb where like anyone that thought there was like a whiff of like some kind of drinking water problem, like people would be on it like, immediately. like the next day they'd be like freaking scientists and microscopes like studying the heck out of that. And then if it's some poor black community in Ohio, like, they'll just be, it's like, just turn a blind eye. And that's that's an emblem of what's gone wrong in our country, is that we size people up based upon their economic value as opposed to their human value. So the slogan for my campaign is humanity first, is that we're all human beings, we all have equal value, and we need to start acting like that. And just because a community might not have the political clout or the financial resources does not mean that we can poison their kids and think that's a moral way to operate as a country.
What would you say to the people of Flint in particular who feel that racism is fueling this crisis where they can't go to the tap and drink clean water?
I would say they feel that way because that's accurate, and that it would be actually highly bizarre if they did not feel that way. So, it's like I agree with them. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And as president, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Flint. I'm going to stand there and I'm going to be like, hey, I promise you that I'm going to come back and just drink from a tap. And whatever needs to happen between now and then, so that actually, scratch that. I have 2 kids who are 6 and 3. They're going to drink from the tap. And so whatever we need to do between when I'm there and my kids drinking from the tap, that's what we're going to do.
Right on. So.
And one of the things I said to Breakfast Club in that interview was that the median African American net worth is projected to be 0 by 2053. And now you have to ask, why the heck is that?
What does that exactly mean for us, for black people by 2053? What would that look like?
Yeah, and this is why I'm running for president, why I'm so passionate about our need to really evolve and get our heads out of the sand. So if you look at the 5 most common jobs in the U.S. economy, and the African American community will be occupying many of these jobs. Number 1 is retail, and 30% of American malls and stores are closing. The average retail worker is a 39-year-old woman making between $10 and $11 an hour. So if 30% of those stores close, what happens to those jobs and families? Another top job is customer service and call centers. Artificial intelligence is going to be able to do the job of the 2.5 million call center workers in the United States who right now make $14 an hour. So then what happens to those workers? So these are jobs that are filled by the majority of Americans, including Americans of color. And so then if you're automating away those jobs as fast as possible, which is what we're doing, then who bears the brunt of it? And also who wins? The people who win will be the big tech companies and the folks at the top. And we know those organizations aren't exactly the most representative of the U.S. population or the most diverse.
Oh, not at all, which goes to the point of closing the racial wealth gap.
Yes.
So how do you specifically plan on addressing this issue, particularly for black people, so that the gap that we are experiencing closes before 2053?
Exactly, and it's one reason why I'm so excited about the Freedom Dividend, putting $1,000 a month into the hands of every American adult starting at age 18, which is what I'm proposing and is what we can make happen in 2021 when I'm president. But this is something that Martin Luther King championed in 1967, the year before he was killed. And he was prescient. He saw a lot of things coming, and he said, look, we need to actually just move towards putting money into the hands of African American families and consumers and communities and businesses, and this is the way to do it.
How else would you address this gap, particularly particularly creating a plan for black people, not specifically to everybody else?
Well, so there are issues specific to the black community that you need separate plans to try and address. What I'm suggesting is that first, if you start with this $1,000 a month in everyone's hands, then that disproportionately helps people that are more excluded. Like, so, and by the math, it actually does reduce the wealth gap and income inequality.
By how much, though? By how much?
It's really significant. Like, you're talking about the single biggest move that would actually close the vast wealth gap that anyone has proposed right now is what I'm proposing. And so if you had $12,000 per year, and imagine you have a household with like 2 adults and an 18-year-old, that's $36,000 a year in that household. And so it ends up closing the wealth gap very, very quickly. And then the great thing is that there's like the effect of all of that money circulating in that community. And one thing I've said is that if you want to strengthen African American owned businesses, you have to get money into the hands of African American consumers.
Do you believe in reparations?
Yeah, so I 100% agree with the moral case for reparations. I read Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's clear that this country was built on the backs of slaves. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, what can we get done as a society to help try and make that right? When in reality, there's really nothing anyone can do that can make that right. Like, you can't go back and undo, decades of like subjugation and inhumanity. There's no dollar amount you could be like, and like everything is now copacetic.
It's not going to make it better, but it'll make people feel a little bit better.
and I'm a numbers guy, and I agree that like reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' analysis, if you were to put a number on it, that number would be enormous, like rightfully so.
And so is slavery and white supremacy, right?
Exactly. Like if you were to put a number on it, the number is like in the trillions, realistically, because then if you look at that dollar amount. And then grow it over time and extrapolate it. So the question is, how do we get started? And what I'm going to suggest is the way we get started is we put $1,000 a month into everyone's hands. That would be literally hundreds of billions of dollars in the hands of African Americans every single year.
We get that. So
and then at that point, then you start looking and saying, okay, what more can we do? But you start with something that will disproportionately help people of color.
Not people of color. Black people.
Yes.
Let's stick to black people. And you agree with the moral argument.
Yes.
Do you agree with a practical economic plan that will carry out some form of reparations, whatever it may be, for black people?
I believe that we need to move in that direction as fast as possible, yes.
Do you think soon that you will come up with a plan of what that could potentially look like?
Well, so I have some policy proposals that are specifically directed at strengthening, the black community.
Tell us more.
So one is that if you look at historically black colleges and universities, the problem in our educational system is that it makes more sense to cater to people that have lots of money that can pay you and then donate afterwards.
Sure.
Meanwhile, HBCUs have been incredibly successful at elevating the paths of hundreds of thousands of African Americans, and a lot of those schools are now struggling because they're serving a group that doesn't necessarily have the means to come back and donate a ton. So the federal government needs to step in and say, look, we need to shore up the endowments of these historically black colleges and universities that have been awesomely successful and been pillars of our country for decades in many cases, because this is something where the market will not suffice.
The problem is that there are plenty of black folk who have all types of degrees and they can't find jobs, right? So that goes back to the reparations question. Investing in education does not necessarily equal being able to get into the workforce. Is there anything else that has an economic incentive that will repay black people for the economic racism that we have endured for hundreds of years?
Yes. So the way I agree with you that at this point, getting a degree does not ensure a stable livelihood afterwards. I mean, the underemployment rate for recent college graduates in this country is 44%, and that's across everyone. And so that rate's
sure
probably
black people are far worse.
Yeah, it's probably even higher. Yeah, it's probably even higher. So that is one thing that I believe we have to try and adjust to, is like, if someone's like, hey, education, the fact is, like, you get a degree now, like, you might just have this giant debt load and no job at the end of it. So the next big move we have to make is we just have to start putting $1,000 a month into everyone's hands, that then ends up really diversifying people's options. Because a lot of people go into various higher education programs because they feel like that's like their only secure path forward. And then they wind up with a debt load, and it may or may not work out. Whereas if you're putting $12,000 a year into people's hands, then like how many more entrepreneurs would there be? How many more artists and creatives would there be? How many more people would be able to chart a different sort of path for themselves that's not dependent necessarily upon a degree or credential?
You know, you talk about climate change a lot, right? And your plan includes like funding for health initiatives and research for respiratory diseases caused by air emissions. And you know that EPA scientists found in a recent study that black people are disproportionately impacted by poor air quality. How much of the research made that you're proposing will be directed to black communities that's most impacted by air emissions?
Yeah, I've seen that set of research, and it's true that African American communities are disproportionately affected by air quality. And so I would want to put the money to work where the problems are most acute. And so if there's a population that's disproportionately affected, then the resources should represent that.
What does that, I mean, resources to reflect it, but more specifically, as president, what would be your first move? Like, what would that look like?
So, I mean, you're talking about, like, let's say, for example, it's like NIH grants. So it could be that everyone, like, if you're trying to study the effects of air pollution on various populations, then the NIH would dispense various grants. If the impact is disproportionate on the black community, then a disproportionate amount of the grant money should go towards trying to address that problem.
Okay. So you call for prioritizing sustainable infrastructure in urban development, right? And taking advantage of new materials and designs. And I think there is no city that would be ground zero for that than Flint, Michigan.
Yes, I agree.
And who are the members of the Yanggang?
So I've been running for president for a bit more than a year, and the name Yanggang bubbled up a long time ago. And so we've had like the Yanggang as like our official campaign headquarters for a while. But then what you're talking about is that I became something of a social media phenomenon over the last 6 weeks or so. You know, like the enthusiasm, I have to say, when I go to college campuses and whatnot, it seems like it tends to skew young and very internet-y. Like they make a lot of memes. The energy at our rallies is sky high, where we just had a rally of 3,000 people in San Francisco and then 1,000 in Chicago. We were joking, it's like, man, we could plant the flag in a lot of places, and apparently like hundreds, maybe thousands of people come out. So we're going to test that out. I'm doing a national tour starting in mid-April. But when you see the energy in person, then it makes you very excited about all the enthusiasm online because it's translating into the real world. It's not just people making memes. It's actually people who want to come out and make real change.
You've talked about how capitalism doesn't center real people, and you've called for a more human-centered capitalism. What exactly does that mean?
Capitalism right now, it's become this winner-take-all economy, particularly in the US. You have this crony capitalism and really wealthy interests just pulling the strings. And they talk about competition, and a lot of the biggest industries are getting much less competitive. Like you see consolidation in the big tech companies, you see consolidation in the big banks and financial companies. So we need to start using different measurements to try and drive our economy and society forward, where if you just use capital efficiency, we're going to lose more and more to software, robots, AI, and machines. So we should, instead of using GDP and capital efficiency, we should be using things like how our kids are doing, our own mental health and freedom from substance abuse, average income and affordability, clean air and clean water, and then use those as the actual measurements of economic progress.
Everything that you're saying sounds like you're centering people, which to me seems like the antithesis of capitalism itself. And it sounds like you are calling for a reform to capitalism.
We need to evolve as fast as possible, because if you just rely upon capital efficiency, and the example I use in a lot of contexts is, look, there are 3.5 million Americans who drive trucks for a living. So in 10 years, if you have trucks that can drive themselves, doesn't matter if you're a really hardworking, attentive truck driver or a shoddy one. Like the robot's going to beat both of you. You know what I mean? It's not like it's not dependent upon your own individual characteristics. So if we use who can drive the truck better, everyone loses. You know, and so we need to have better measurements than that as fast as possible. I think of it as evolving to the next stage of our economy. But I 100% agree that if you just use capital efficiency as a measuring stick, we're all going to lose.
One of your main goals is to implement what you've called a universal basic income.
The freedom dividend.
Yes, there you go, the freedom dividends. You talk about the humanity-adjusted GDP.
Yes.
Right? So just tell us exactly what that entails.
Well, so GDP is something we made up almost 100 years ago during the Great Depression. And I'd like to talk about my wife. My wife's at home with our 2 boys, one of whom is autistic, and her work every day counts as 0 in GDP. So GDP is not measuring the right things. So if we were to measure how our kids are doing and how we're doing, like how we're thriving or not thriving, like that's actually the measurement for our economy that we need to move towards as fast as possible. And the great thing is, as president, when I'm in the White House in 2021, all I have to do is just walk down the street to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics and say, hey guys, GDP, almost 100 years old, kind of useless. And so we're going to update it to things like how our kids are doing, how our environment is doing, how we're doing, like whether we're mentally healthy, because there's a mental health crisis in this country.
You make that sound a lot easier than what many people think it actually will be.
Well, changing the measurements is pretty easy, but then changing the way our economy functions is obviously a little trickier.
Which is the point, right? Yeah. So how do you plan on working with Congress in order to carry that out? Because what you're saying immediately is going to pop up in people's mind like, you're a socialist and you want to give people free stuff and you're going to scare the hell out of people.
You know, what I'm happy to say is that millions of Americans are waking up to the reality that we can't use these 20th century frameworks for problems of 2020 and beyond. It's not like people in 1914 when they're drawing this stuff up were like artificial intelligence, like self-driving vehicles. They did see a lot of this stuff coming. One thing I'm happy to say is, as president, I actually don't need Congress's approval to change the statistics. Like, that's not a congressional thing. That's like like an agency thing, a branch. You literally can just walk down the street and say, hey guys, like, let's use some new stats.
How come no one else has done that?
Well, it's because we've been focused on the wrong things. Like, if you look at the big measurements that we're using for the economy, it's GDP, which is like near a record high, stock market growth, which doesn't affect the bottom 80% of Americans for the most part, and then headline unemployment rate, which, even though it looks good right now, there are millions of Americans that have just dropped out of the workforce, including 1 out of 5 prime working age American men. So they just have the wrong measurements. And as someone who's done a few things that required you to actually see where you're going, like, if you have the wrong measurements, you're doomed. So I can't speak to why we've been hanging on to this GDP measurement for 100 years, even though the inventor of GDP even said this is a terrible measurement for national well-being. We should never use it as that.
So we need to completely get rid of that and replace it with something that deals more with how
we're doing, right.
What do you say to people who don't know you, and the first thing that pops in their mind is, this man does not stand a chance in hell of winning?
Well, it's funny. There are various sites where they put odds on someone becoming the nominee, and right now I'm 5th. They have me at 14% to win the nomination, and the reason for that is that I'm already peeling off voters from all these different segments of the population, in part because I'm telling the truth about what's happening to our society. And so my chances of winning go up every single day. And I've already qualified for the Democratic primary debates, raised over $1 million in increments of only $20 in the last 5 weeks. This campaign is just going to keep on rising. We're going to peak at the right time. And then when I'm president, I'm going to get people that money, because that's what people have put me in the Oval Office to do.
That bag, right?
I'm going to get you that bag.
Are you going to give me mine first?
Yeah, man. You can be there at the inauguration.
Okay.